what kinds of actions are really good for Israel's security in the medium and the long term. And we have seen several military assaults on Gaza over the years, which have not actually prevented the rocket attacks by Hamas. They didn't prevent October the 7th. And I think there is a huge question mark over whether the large scale killing of civilians in Gaza is really going to contribute to Israel's security over the medium and long term. I can see there's a short term weakening of Hamas, but we really want to draw attention to, as it were, the demand side of these problems and not just the supply side. What is it that makes people want to embrace violence? One can understand in a way some of that perceived imperative, to respond aggressively to 9/11. But this in a way is part of the problem, that in these moments of extreme emotion and suffering and indeed humiliation, really, for the American government in particular, policies are formulated that are based in a way on this oversimplified idea that if you can get rid of a finite number of evil people, you will have solved the problem. And then you get this kind of escalating and in practice endless series of interventions and wars built on that premise, starting with Afghanistan and then spreading to Iraq, but also spreading much beyond that in terms of the Sahel, places like Sri Lanka, countries like Syria as well. A lot of governments ended up invoking this idea of a global war on terror to pursue their own counterinsurgencies, to pursue their own internal repression, to get resources internationally, just as governments had done with the war on communism a long time ago. So these kind of projects, which start with a moment of suffering and a moment of, in a way, self-righteousness, acquire really a life of their own and become fairly systematically gamed, by people, security companies in Afghanistan, making huge amounts of money from the American taxpayer, and getting drawn into these peculiar arrangements where they were effectively paying the Taliban not to attack them. So you end up, as it were, funding exactly the terrorists that you claim to be opposing. I think there are a lot of examples where the enemy, the terrorist enemy, has actually become quite useful for repressive governments and for people making money out of a crisis, and has been nurtured behind the scenes as Assad did in Syria with ISIS. So these things become very complicated very quickly, and they set up a lot of perverse incentives that we need to understand before we launch into them. And they're very difficult to reverse once you've started.
For a lot of people listening, though, they might say, well, lots of people will say, well, it's not complicated at all if you see, scenes of devastation or murders by terrorists or terror attacks. What is complicated morally about trying to get the people who did it? That you may say that's simplified, but for some people, the moral dimension is incredibly clear.
I agree that for some people, the moral dimension is incredibly clear, but that is also a moment of extreme moral danger. And I think, one of the things that we've missed, and it's obviously very relevant today, is that if the greater the indiscriminacy in your counterterrorism policy, the more civilians get killed, the more countries get roped in that were not part of the original 9/11 conspiracy, the more enemies you're actually going to be creating. So we know that terrorist attacks actually rose globally from about 3,000 in the year 2000 to 30,000 in 2015. So that's an increase of about 10 times. And when we get fixated on this group of people that we want to punish or eliminate, we forget that our tactics in trying to punish or eliminate them are creating so many more enemies. They're enraging people. They're making people feel that they're going to be attacked whether or not they support terrorism. And that is a very radicalizing thing to do.
Well, Ruben Anderson, you can look at lots of foreign policy failures in this regard. Afghanistan, a recent one. You've got lots of research on the scale of the failure of US policy there, but it's not all necessarily an unremittingly negative story. I mean, can you look at, say, the destruction of the ISIS caliphate as an example of success in the war on terror, or is your contention that there is no such thing? It's the wrong paradigm. You can't win the war on terror.
Well, part of the problem here is how the knowledge environment, the information environment is constructed around these often very simplified wars. And that involves setting out certain piecemeal successes along the way. We all remember when George W. Bush said mission accomplished back in the early days of the Iraq invasion, upon which, of course, followed, among other things, the growth of ISIS on the back of the utter chaos that Iraq had been left in, and huge human suffering and large-scale violence and displacement. So by presenting the battle against ISIS as a success, we have really broken down what is a huge failure, a huge and costly failure, into a series of discrete elements that policymakers and politicians can somehow sell in the short run as wins against terrorism. But what really all these small wins add up to in the long run is a much larger failure. And that failure involves an absence of learning really from the mistakes and from how the interventions themselves, staged in the name of fighting terror or any other given threat, have contributed to and fueled the problem in the way that David just described for us.
I'm interested as to, because you obviously wrote this book before, long before October the 7th, but I'm interested in your view as to where Israel's response, which many people has been infinitely analysed, widely criticised, but there is, at its heart, it is a state responding to a terror attack by a group with the express founding purpose of killing as many Jews as possible, responding in its own self-defense. Obviously, since lots of things have happened and lots of allegations have been made, and there have been many civilian casualties in Gaza. But I'm interested in your view, Ruben, as to how the sort of what we've seen in the Middle East over the past 50 days fits into your thesis.
There's something, of course, we've been thinking about, starting with the horrific massacres of 7th of October and continuing with the horrific scale of violence in Gaza. One thing that's very important to note, I mean, we don't talk about this particular conflict in Reconomics. We focus on the war on terror, the global war on terror, and associated wars, especially those waged by states in Europe and North America. But of course, it's something we have been thinking about, where we need a bit more distance. And I think often that's what's lacking here, a bit of analytical distance to take stock of what's really going on, what lessons can be learned. But I think one lesson is already coming through, for instance, in the words of Joe Biden, when he said we shouldn't, or Israel should not repeat the mistakes we made in the aftermath of 9/11. There may be a moment there of moral clarity, of course, of huge suffering and trauma informed by very particular histories of anti-Semitism and so forth. But there were already there some lessons that perhaps were being seen from Washington in how the longer-running global war on terror had been going wrong, ending with that ignominious exit from Afghanistan that you played back to us at the start of this clip. So there are lessons to be learned here. We are still in the process of trying to understand what's going on, but perhaps David has a word or two to add.
Well, let's move on to... oh, sorry, David, go on.
No, I was just going to say quickly, I mean, a lot of people say Israel has a right to self-defense. I think, from a economics point of view, one would want to ask what kinds of actions are really good for Israel's security in the medium and the long term. And we have seen several military assaults on Gaza over the years, which have not actually prevented the rocket attacks by Hamas. They didn't prevent October the 7th. And I think there is a huge question mark over whether the large-scale killing of civilians in Gaza is really going to contribute to Israel's security over the medium and long term. I can see there's a short-term weakening of Hamas. But we really want to draw attention to, as it were, the demand side of these problems and not just the supply side. What is it that makes people want to embrace violence?
Which is, it's partly because what happened on October the 7th was so horrific, and those short-term questions are so pressing for the Israelis that those sort of longer-term questions are much harder to consider in the, as you say, in the heat of the moment, particularly a moment so traumatizing and horrific for the Israeli state and the Jewish people. It's much harder to consider, to get into the realms of that sort of thing when you have civilian children held hostage underneath tunnels in Gaza and the like. Right, let's move on to another war waged by politicians, particularly in the US, the war on drugs. Now, David Keane, we heard generations, half a century there of US politicians declaring war on drugs. Clearly, politicians across the world in countries that take that sort of approach to drug legislation, including here, tend to think of it primarily as a domestic issue in terms of drug use on the streets or the impact on individual families. But it's a global trade, and you argue that anti-drug policies such as those we just heard the likes of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush outline, you argue that those anti-drugs policies have failed to stop the supply and consumption of drugs and the global economies that sustain them.
Yeah, I think what we want to draw attention to, in part, in all of our all the different spheres that we're looking at, the war on terror, the war on drugs, so-called fight against illegal migration, is that there needs to be some kind of cost-benefit analysis that's actually radically different from what people normally mean by a cost-benefit analysis, where we actually disaggregate and we give a good picture of on which groups do the costs of a particular policy fall, and which are the groups who benefit from that policy and from the perpetuation of that policy, even when perhaps it's failing in its most loudly proclaimed aims. So this is something general that we're calling for. And I think in terms of the war on drugs, there are so many costs that habitually fall under the radar. You can construct a set of metrics where you look at, the drugs that have been intercepted, the drug lords who've been arrested, the area of drug cultivation that's been destroyed, and so on, where you can register, rather like we were talking about with the war on terror, you can register a whole series of successes that are politically advantageous. But then what tends to go missing is perhaps the fact very often that drugs production has been increasing, that the flows of drugs into other countries have been increasing, and there's a very selective use of metrics there. So alongside that story of success, which in many ways is a phony story, we find these, as it were, hidden failures, some of which are quite familiar, In terms of the massive violence in somewhere like Mexico, the gaming of the war on terror in the Philippines, the mass incarceration in the United States, about 300,000 people incarcerated in 1980 when Reagan came into power, rising to about 2 million by the turn of the century. I mean, that is a massive human catastrophe and a scandal that is in large part, but not entirely, the result of the war on drugs. So we want to draw attention to those costs and also to the people that are gaming this war, just as they've gamed many other kinds of wars.
And Ruben Anderson, what is the solution? The sort of approach we've seen in Portugal, where the whole system has been decriminalised?
There's certainly a lot of very good lessons to learn from partial decriminalization, we should say, because many of the countries that have experimented with this haven't gone the whole way. They have perhaps legalized or non-enforced consumption, but retain other bits of the criminalization spectrum. But there are many lessons to be learned from a harm reduction approach to drugs that don't have to go all the way towards a full-scale commercialization of drugs, for instance. And Portugal is one of those countries that had experimented with this, has seen some relatively positive results. And we should always remember the true scale of the disasters in the wake of the war on drugs. Mass incarceration, as David mentioned, huge scale of violence in countries for the transit of drugs, some 360,000 homicides in Mexico since Felipe Calderon started his war on drugs in the mid-2000s, for instance. Duterte's similar large-scale killing campaigns. And of course, the huge health costs of drug abuse and unsafe drug use in destination countries. It claims tens upon tens of thousands of lives. So clearly there's a strong public health case here for moving towards another approach that takes account of the full costs of the current enforcement-led approach. And the lack of that kind of assessment, which we would expect to see in any taxpayer-funded line of policy intervention, is one of the most striking things that we discuss in Reconomics.
Let's talk about immigration. David Keane, immigration, very timely question given the state of the debate in Westminster currently. It's a distinctly modern and timely issue, but not one that's going away anytime soon. At the end of the Second World War, there were, by some counts, fewer than 10 border walls or fences in the world, you write. Today, there are more than 70. The border security market is, in one estimate, to be soon worth more than $65 billion. People smuggling is itself now a huge industry. Climate change is making all of these questions more urgent. What's your prognosis?
Well, I'll keep my reply short because Ruben is really the big expert on migration. But I think that, we can see from those clips, there's a huge political windfall to be had from the immigration issue. And actually, this issue has not been solved or tackled properly for decades, but it remains politically a gift that keeps on giving. So I think it's a classic example of something that's not working, but it is actually working politically. The reasons why that problem has persisted and why are complex, but I think Ruben maybe will, is the best person for this.
Well, Ruben, a final word from you.
Well, a few weeks ago, I sat with a border guard chief in a Spanish enclave in North Africa, surrounded by tall fences built to halt migration. He's the one in charge of it, and he's telling me migration is not a policing problem. It's a multidisciplinary problem, these are his words, which requires a political solution. So even the border guards themselves keep telling us and keep telling me throughout years of research that this is not about enforcement. You can't enforce your way out of an issue that's really driven by a highly complex set of factors of supply and demand. Like in the war on drugs, just thinking you can crack down on people smugglers, crack down on the supply, as it were, of people arriving into your country will not work. And there are some really terrible parallels here with what's going on in the UK now and what happened around the European external borders some 10, 20 years ago. Exactly the same pattern of displaced routes, stronger smuggling networks, and a whole set of political games around the fight against migration. It will not go away anytime soon. It will worsen unless we take a rational and clear-eyed view of the politics of migration regionally, nationally, on a global scale.
Well, as ever, Ruben Anderson, that's easier said than done, as I'm sure you well know from writing. Reconomics, Why It's Time to End the War and Everything, alongside David Keane. Thank you very much both for joining us for that fascinating discussion. And you can listen to it, should you so wish, whenever you like, on the Red Box podcast, wherever you get your podcast from, a little bit later.